0.59 for each 1 milligram. But, of course, in Canada, you're okay because no one's measuring the fluoride in the urine of your children, so we have no need to worry about that. Now, there's two preposterous notions here. What parent in their right mind would put their children's teeth above their brains? And secondly, what government would support a program aimed at lowering tooth decay by at most 0.6 of one tooth surface if it lowered the IQ of the population by even a small amount? It's a preposterous notion to entertain, and yet we have to entertain that. Or we have to entertain an atrocious lack of due diligence. That whilst individual scientists like myself can find out and read these papers, apparently it's beyond the expertise of Health Canada to read these papers or to take them seriously. Health Canada has not conducted a single IQ study in Canada. Next subject. Several lines of information indicate an effect of fluoride exposure on thyroid function. You know, doctors in Europe and Argentina in the 30s, 40s, and 50s used to give fluoride tablets to people with overactive thyroid glands to lower the activity of the thyroid glands. And in 1985, in the Ukraine, Bajinsky and co-workers found a lowering of thyroid function in people drinking water at 2.3 parts per million. And again, no margin of safety. Now, if fluoride lowers thyroid function, it could explain the delayed eruption of teeth, it could explain the lowered IQ in children, and it would explain this massive increase that we have in hypothyroidism among US citizens and Canadians in North America. You know, we have something like between 20 and 40 million Americans with hypothyroidism. And the symptoms: depression, lethargy, tiredness, not relieved by sleep, obesity. And yet, in Health Canada has not conducted a single study to examine a possible relationship between exposure to fluoridated water and hypothyroidism. They're just not looking. And yet this is very serious. It's one of the diseases that Pam was talking about, these debilitating diseases. Fluoride and bone. The first symptoms of fluoride's damage to the bone, about 50% of the fluoride, all the fluoride that we can ingest each day from toothpaste, from water, from food, etc., pesticides, accumulates in our bone, about 50%. And the concentrations in our bone continue to increase over a lifetime. And the first symptoms that fluoride is damaging the bone is that you get stiffness in the joints, pains in the joints, pains in the bones. And these are identical to arthritis. And in America, we have 1 in 3 Americans now with arthritis. And if you ask a doctor, "Doc, I've got arthritis, what's the cause of that?" And he will say, or she will say, "We don't really know, but we think it's got something to do with aging." Well, could it possibly be the aging in whether you've lived in a fluoridated community for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, or what have you? Once again, Health Canada has not conducted a single study to examine a possible relationship between exposure to fluoridated water and arthritis. They're not even measuring fluoride in bone to get a handle on this, or fluoride in the urine, as I've already mentioned. Now, what we're also concerned about is that it makes the bones more brittle. And the bone that we're concerned about breaking in elderly people is this bone which joins the hip bone to the pelvis. And when that breaks, it's very serious for an elderly person because you have to immobilize the patient when you're trying to mend this break. And that, by the time the elderly person has been immobilized for 6 weeks, a couple of months, all their muscles have atrophied. They can't get mobility back. So 50% of elderly people that get that bone broken never regain an independent existence, and 25% are dead within a year of that break. And so if indeed fluoride contributed to the breaking of that bone, it will be incredibly serious. And the studies are mixed. There are some studies which shows that that people in fluoridated areas have higher hip fracture rates than non-fluoridated areas, and we have other studies which show the opposite. But this is the most important study as far as I'm concerned. This is a study conducted by an American group from Loma Linda University in China. And again, they used the same approach. Very stable Chinese population, everything very similar except for the level of fluoride in the water. And you've got these 6 villages in which the fluoride levels are increasing steadily. And if you compare the hip fracture rates with the village at 1 part per million, that's village 3, you'll see that the hip fracture rates double for villages 4 and 5, and they triple for village 6. And at village 6, that is statistically significant. Now, there's 2 interpretations of this data, okay? If you're pro-fluoridation, you only accept village 6 because it's the only one with statistical significance. And so the assumption for the people that are pro-fluoridation is that no effect is on hip fracture until your levels in the water goes up to about 4 parts per million, which in this context was about 14 milligrams of fluoride a day. And then suddenly it triples. This threshold, it suddenly goes from no change to tripling. Opponents of fluoridation say that's unreasonable. We think it's more reasonable that what we're looking at is a trend here. It may not have reached statistical significance, but we think that trend is real. In which case, hip fractures may be increasing as low as 3 milligrams a day, which is easily achieved. If you drink 3 liters of water a day, you're going to get 3 milligrams. I was in Western Australia a couple of weeks ago, and I met somebody in the mining industry, and he told me that the miners there drink between 10 and 12 liters of water a day. And I can tell you that those miners are going to wreck their bones after 10, 20 years drinking that water, which they have to drink because it's so darn hot in those mines. Now, fluoride may cause osteosarcoma. This is a very interesting case where we can see the clash between science and politics. In 2001, Dr. Elise Bassin, a dentist, successfully had defended her doctoral thesis at Harvard University. She found in an excellent study, a matched case control study, that if young boys were exposed to fluoridated water in their 6th, 7th or 8th years, by the way, this corresponds to the mid-childhood growth spurt, it's when the bones are turning over fast, had a 5 to 7-fold increase in developing osteosarcoma by the age of 20, compared to children that were not exposed to fluoride in this same period. So they looked as if there was a window of vulnerability. Now her boss, this is the politics, Chester Douglas, who is a consultant for Colgate, who actually edited their weekly report, who is a known promoter of fluoridation, who had actually co-authored a paper which made it very clear indeed, that if there was a relationship between fluoridation and osteosarcoma, it would be the end of fluoridation, which he lamented because it was so good for children's teeth. Anyway, so his position was very clear. Promoter of fluoridation. Between 2001 and 2005, he had at least 3 opportunities to warn the public, to warn his peers, to warn the regulatory agencies that his graduate student had found that finding. He did not do so. He went to England in 2002 and he spoke before the British Fluoridation Society, and he said, my studies show no relationship between osteosarcoma and fluoridation. And he somehow forgot to mention his graduate student's work. He was asked to present a written statement on his work to the National Research Council, and again he said, my work shows no relationship between osteosarcoma and fluoridation. This time he put Bassin's thesis as a footnote, but he didn't tell them that the footnote contradicted what he was telling them. Well, run the clock forward. In 2006, In 2005, my son, Michael, found this thesis in the rare book section of the Harvard Library and sent the chapter which dealt with this study to the National Research Council and also to the Environmental Working Group, who then tipped off the press, and it was a big scandal. It was covered in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, and on Fox TV. And the EWG called for an investigation of Chester Douglas, but Harvard did the investigation and they exonerated this professor. He didn't knowingly, get that, he didn't knowingly conceal his graduate students' work from anybody. Doddering old twit, I suppose we have to assume. Anyway, in 2006, she published her work with 3 other co-authors in Cancer Causes and Control. And Douglas, who up to this point has proceeded with the speed of a castrated snail, suddenly springs into action. And in the same issue of the journal, puts in a letter telling people not to take her work too seriously because he was going to publish a study which showed that this relationship didn't hold in the larger study. And he promised this study for the summer of 2006, and we're still waiting for Chester Goddo Douglas to produce this study. But meanwhile, Health Canada, the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council, and other health agencies in promoting fluoridating countries have used this promise of a study which has not been peer-reviewed or published to negate Bassin's findings. It's outrageous. Health Canada is doing that. No, we're still waiting. The promotion of fluoridation is unprofessional and unscientific. This is from a white paper from the American Dental Association. Individual dentists must be convinced that they need not be familiar with scientific reports of laboratory and field investigations on fluoridation to be effective participants in the promotion program, and that non-participation is overt neglect of professional responsibility. Can you imagine any other profession in the world telling its membership you don't have to be knowledgeable of the literature to go out there and promote something, which may actually be killing people, by the way? You can imagine engineers. We're going to build a wonky old bridge over here. And if you don't go out there and tell the public that this bridge is really sound, it's overt neglect of your professional response. I mean, it's just bizarre. Monty Python, where are you? Okay. For over 60 years, the fluoridation debate has been controlled largely by the dental profession. This profession has a single focus on teeth, with little or no expertise on other health issues. This is how they see us. Mouths with little legs on. You know, that's it. They just see a hole. The teeth, the teeth, the teeth. We've got to protect the teeth, the teeth, the teeth, the teeth. To hell with the kidneys, to hell with the lungs, to hell with the brains, to hell with the kidneys. We've got to protect the teeth. There has been no formal investigation of the many anecdotal reports that some individuals are highly sensitive to fluoride, gastrointestinal, neurological, and skin conditions, even though people have volunteered to be guinea pigs if the government would attempt to put this on a scientific level.